as David just said, I'm in computer graphics. And in graphics, what we're concerned about is making tools so that users can design material appearance. And that may be the appearance for objects that are going to appear in some virtual presentation like film or games. But we're also interested in using the computer to design appearance for objects that will be physically manufactured. And the topics I was trying to think of the last time I talked to, at least a subset of this group was a couple of years ago, and many things have happened in the last couple of years. So I'll try to sort of catch up. Some of you will hear a bit of a repeat of some of the efforts, but I want to talk about where we have continued. So three major topics. One is how to navigate through material space, then looking at bi-scale design, and finally, sort of one of the hottest things we're looking at these days is proceduralizing materials given exemplars. So material space navigation. So this is the idea that one way you can think of material design is you have some material that you're looking at on the computer, and you say, well, what I want is a little more this way, or a little more that way, or a little more this. And the question is, what is this little more that you wanted, and in what direction, and how do you tell the computer that that's how you want the appearance to change? And so what we want to find are what are the most natural axes for navigating appearance. Is it, I want it dirtier, I want it blurrier, I want it greasier? What are the natural axes? And then what kind of graphical interface do we present to people to move along those axes? And this is work that was just presented this past spring at the Yale Graphics Rendering Symposium. And we did this along with Cyril Soleil, who's a researcher at INRIA, France. So navigating means we need to have our materials organized in some logical fashion. And one way to organize things is by class. We recognize that metal, plastics, rubbers, these are different classes of materials. And then, so we have a classification of the material. And then within the classes, we want to estimate the parameters that make that particular member of the class unique. And so that's the basic approach we're taking along many lines of research, is classification and then estimation. And so this general idea, in graphics in particular, there are some people who advocate that material appearance is one big space, and if you could just find the right coordinates, you could move anywhere between the appearance of car paint to the appearance of an orange to the appearance of cat fur. So that's one view. The view we take is that material appearance are these various little islands of different classes of appearance, and the axes you want to move on are unique to each class. So with that in mind, we decided let's focus on one class and see if we can find intuitive axes for one class of materials. And we focused on metals. And so we basically have a three-step process. We collected a lot of data on metal appearance. Then we took these observations and embedded them in a low-dimensional space. And then we developed a way to interpolate in that space and then produce a new reflectance model for using in our application. So the way we wanted to study metals is not, most graphics applications, you choose some model like Cook Torrance or Ward or something, and then you navigate by adjusting the parameters of that model. But there's no guarantee that one particular model will will represent all metals and say just metals within some range. So to really study how people perceive metals, we wanted to use just measured data, so that BRDF, bidirectional reflectance distribution functions, from things we know are metals. And that means basically for each material, we have this 4-dimensional table that you can think of as a 2-dimensional table of like the elevation of incident light and the elevation of viewing, and then within each that the azimuth of the incident light and the azimuth of the viewing direction. And then, of course, we have an RGB triplet for each of those. So we want to use this tabular so that we know we're looking at metals. We're not building into our understanding some assumptions that are in models like Octoer and so forth. So to gather people's view of metals, we presented them these data achromatic for 39 different measured metal samples. And we used this particular geometry, which in previous graphics literature has been determined allows one to see sort of a large number of views and variations that are important to judging a material. And so this was the experiment we presented to people. So there are 39 stimuli, and it was a modified 2 alternative force choice in that you picked which 2 out of the 3 looked most like each other. And out of 39 to thoroughly investigate the space, we used adaptive sampling to have a smaller number of triplets to examine. And of course, we used a training set and a validation set. Using Mechanical Turk, we had 360 participants with 30,000 about valid responses. So what this gives us is the information to do a perceptual embedding. You can think of, initially we're using this very high dimensional vector to represent each BRDF, and we know that the vector that can be millions of entries of measurements is far higher than the real dimensionality of BRDF space. And what these comparisons give us is these inequalities of the difference between two samples being less than the difference between 2 other samples. And so what we want to do is find a distance metric that will be consistent with all these observations. And to do that, we use non-metric dimensional scaling. And from that, we found 4 dimensions that explains the overwhelming majority of the data. But just finding an embedding isn't enough. Basically, then we have this 4D space, and we have our 39 samples situated in this space. Now, in order to use this to navigate space, we want to be able to interpolate between these perceptual values. But once we've done an interpolation in that space, we need to go back to BRDF space so that we have something that we can render. So that's the next problem. It's easy enough to interpolate in a 4D space, but then how do we get back to all the values of BRDF for incident and viewing angle? And to do that, we use some previous work that Cyril had done on using Gaussian process regression models to map then from the 4D back to the BRDF space. So doing that, so we have our 4D perceptual model, and then we can, along each axis in that 4D space, interpolate along that axis. and then produce interpolated BRDFs that we can then render. So the idea is now we have these four axes. How do we best allow the user to navigate these in order to specify a particular appearance? So we came up with this editing interface that uses two sort of traditional ways of navigating. One is an image matrix where you have one central appearance, and you want to go to something that's more in the direction of what you want to achieve. You click on another image. Alternatively, you can adjust the appearance by adjusting where you are on one of the axes. So you have two ways to move. And this is an example of the interface that we presented users in tests, where you have a current material and you have the target material that you want to match in your design process. And so we have the image grid and the sliders. So we have a gradual variation along each axis, along each row, and we can change what the values are for the center object by moving along this axis. And we can say whether we want to have a very fine control, small step size, or larger steps along this axis. So what we did is we wanted to look at how efficient, accurate people were using this interface, and in what their behavior was using the sliders versus the image matrix. So we did a comparison between three settings. One is, our perceptual axes, image navigation, and the sliders. Then we let people do the same task with one of the traditional physical models like Octoer that lets you adjust roughness and so forth, but both the image navigation and the sliders. And then we gave them just sliders on our perceptual axes. So first, this is the task that they trained on, to understand the task. Here's your starting point. Try to find the settings to achieve this appearance. And then once they're trained, they had three tasks for designing these three, or specifying these three target materials. Now, one thing is does this allow people to perform more quickly? And looking at timings, it's initially sort of disappointing that the physical axes people were much faster at for all three tasks. But being fast is not good if you get a bad answer. So then we looked at accuracy, and there's different ways of looking at accuracy. We look at how accurate were the parameters they finally found. The image that they finally found, you can measure it by mean squared error or by some perceptual metric. And for the task 1 and 2, it's clear that the physical approach has much higher error. It just, users got to what they felt was the best they could get much faster, but the best they thought they could get was not very good. For the third, they had good accuracy, but our perceptual had relatively comparable accuracy. We also so basically this looks like the perceptual axes are performing well and having people get a good result. And looking at how, in the cases where we had both the image navigation and the sliders, people use a balance of both of them. It's not like they just use the sliders or they just use image selection. They use a balance of both. So the conclusions of this is that we found perceptual embedding that found for perceptual axes. Notice we never had to name them, so we don't have the confusion of trying to explain to people what what Fresnel effect is or what the sharpness of the specular peak is. We just have these 4 axes. We show them what the variation is along them, and then they can just use them without any verbal description. And we found that sliders and an image array are better than just the sliders alone. So that's one topic we've been looking at. Another topic is bi-scale design of physical materials. So this is where when you look close up at things like fabric, you can see detail like how the threads are interwoven. But then when you look at a distance, you can't see the threads, and you have an overall impression, in this case, of a uniform bidirectional reflectance distribution function. And what we wanted to facilitate, and this is something that is a property of many manufactured materials, and we want to allow people to design both. That you have some distant view appearance you want to achieve, and then finding what small scale geometry and BRDF you need to achieve that within the range of geometries and BRDFs that are available to you for physical manufacture. So this is the task. This is, it's one of these waiting to appear accepted papers in IEEE Transactions on Visualization and Computer Graphics. So these are a couple more examples from some work we did some years ago of, like velvet, distant appearance is dependent on these little sort of vertical cylinders. We get appearance of things like shot silk by having a variation in the colors of the warp and the woof threads. And by editing these, we can achieve different distant view appearance. And this is not just limited to fabrics. For example, in these metal plates, by altering the small scale geometry on this metal plate, we can have different reflectance patterns that we see from a distance. So specifically, we want, somebody designs what the appearance will be when viewed from a distance. And then we want to find the BRDF and mesoscale geometry that will achieve that appearance from a selection of BRDFs and small scale geometries that we have at our disposal for manufacturing something. So for example, here are 3 objects, and this is their distant view appearance. We want to find, these small structures which may or may not have the same BRDF as one another that will achieve that distant appearance. And then given that, we can allow the user then to edit within the range of available BRDFs and within the range of achievable small scale structures to make variations of the material. And the important thing is in thinking about physical materials is you don't just design any random appearance, but you're going to end up with something that you can actually make because it's a geometry and that you are able to produce physically. So so we have this design distant appearance. How should that be expressed? Well, the most general way, as in the material appearance, is to use a tabular BRDF, this 4D matrix again. And again, this then takes away any assumptions or limitations that are embedded in any particular analytical model. And where do you get that? Well, you may measure some very expensive material because what your goal is to manufacture something cheaply that looks like that expensive material. So like an expensive leather that you want to make out of plastic or, that kind of thing, or an artist-made design with this node graph that I'll talk about later, may design what they want the material to look at a distance. Or you can actually have a shape and the artist may like paint on it what the desired appearance is. And from that, you can estimate a tabular BRDF. So to solve this problem, basically, we designed this network that it takes as input this target BRDF for the distant appearance, and then it goes through an analysis network that identifies features of that target reflectance function, and then has two branches to estimate the mesoscale geometry and then the BRDF. We do all that achromatically and then solve for colors at the end. One question is, these tabular BRDF are huge, and it's not practical to train on such huge data items. So one is, what is the most effective tabular representation? If you're going to take some subset of the BRDF, which best characterizes the appearance? And there are a number of choices that have been presented in graphics, taking the view from a direct light on a sphere and using that as the estimation, or you can take the retroreflective value for each pair of incident and reflected angles. Or you can just downsample a dense set, or you can take some slice from the BRDF expressed in Rushmeier's half angle. So that's sort of a sub-problem of which of these is best for learning our model. So for our training set, we had 400 BRDFs to use. That we're going to solve for, 100 of them measured and 300 from analytical models. Then we had 2,000 mesoscale geometries that we sampled from 8 categories. The categories, these are the small scale geometries available to us, and they are all parameterized. So for example, the cylinders can be fatter or taller or closer together. So we did training of the networks with the same training set but with different formats, and in testing which was trained best to produce the best testing results on our training data, the retroreflective representation was the best. So these are examples then of for our data set, the things that we held out. These are the sort of the best and the worst of the results for predicting what the answer should have been. These are examples where we take various distant values and find our best fit compared to a fit from some previous work and and not a biscale, but a BRDF fit that was recently published. And in general, we do the best when there's some slight hue variation in view that we can estimate that and produce that with a biscale material. We do have failure cases. This is an iridescent coating that was measured over in EPFL, and we weren't able to find a good solution from that from our network. We did estimate large-scale BRDF for some fabrics that we had on hand, some of these shot silk fabrics. So here we have the distant BRDF we estimated for our samples, what our network predicted for the small-scale structure for the fabric, and a photograph of the actual close-up view. So can we find a mesoscale geometry combined with microscale BRDF for this problem? Yes, if we predefine our range of geometries and BRDFs. So the third problem I want to look at is some more complicated material appearance. The last two basically have this distant, homogeneous, bidirectional reflectance function. Now we want to look at materials that have spatial variations. So they have texture as well as, have a BRDF defined at every location. And our goal here is instead of finding the huge number of parameters for spatial variations as well as BRDF. So instead of navigating to try to find a good starting point, get a good starting point for your material by having either a measured patch or at least an image of your sample material. And what we want to do from that sample is then produce a procedure that represents that material, and then you can edit the material by editing the parameters of that procedural model. So this is work that was in SIG Asia a couple of years ago, so I'll try to go over this quickly because what's more interesting is how we've built on that. So procedural models and graphics, they these days take the form of designing these node graphs to specify a material appearance. So each of these boxes is some basic function, like make a basic grid pattern for bricks, and then modify that with various filters to blur and make ragged edges and make bumpy bricks. And so that's what all these subsequent little basic operations are filters on some basic generated patterns. And in the end, we get an output for specifying the albedo, the roughness, and so forth. So this is, a more comprehensible diagram of these node graphs. You have generators that generate basic patterns, and then those are modified to make more complex appearance. And we want to have the fine scale surface normals and albedo, for example. So this is the kind of graph we want to produce given a sample of the material. So again, we want to use this idea of classes. We're not going to just take any random picture and out of nothing produce a node graph. So we're going to have use a database of real textures and procedural assets. We're going to use neural nets to do parameter estimation, and then we're going to use some style transfer to improve the final result. So basically what we did is for a number of classes, we took huge number of examples of that class and did unsupervised learning to find subclasses within that class. So that then when we have our sample, we can automatically find what subclass it goes into. And with that, we're going to find the best procedural model that we have for that subclass, and then estimate parameters to give the final estimated procedure. So for our classes, in this case, we chose brick, grass, shingles, and stucco, because those are very common materials in architectural visualization. So it's a good start for when you're designing outside scenes. We found all our real world textures for these classes using Google image search. And then we got procedural texture models, node graphs for each category from Substance Share. What's interesting in these learning the categories within each class, we found various numbers of subgroups. And you might think like, well, brick is brick. I mean, how various can that be? Well, this is an example of the 6 subclasses of bricks. There's actually quite a large variety of things that we talk about as brick. And this is an example of the subclasses we found for the different types of grass. And what was interesting here is the circles are the categories that we found from unsupervised learning on our image search, whereas the crosses our output of the procedural models we have. So what's interesting is, certainly for some classes, it's easy to say, if my sample image is in this class, I should use this procedural model to model it. We also found that we had a number of graph samples that none of the current procedural node graphs would cover, indicating that we need to design another starting point node graph for part of the space of grasses. So once we've chosen the procedural model, then we need to estimate the parameters for that graph. So we have a graph, we have our sample image, we want to find the parameters theta that will best estimate it. And we do that by using a neural network to learn the mapping. And so we use a well-known AlexNet network with regression at the end of it. And so here are some examples of some very different input models of brick and the resulting albedo, normal, and rendered images that we get with our procedure. The same for our grass samples, for shingles, and for stucco. Now you may say, like, well, how big a deal was this selecting the model? For this input of brick, if we choose the right one of our input node graphs, we get a pretty decent model out. If we had chosen one of the others, the results can really be quite awful. Similarly for the stucco. So the selection as well as parameter adjustment are both important. So why do we want to do this? Well, when in graphics, we have a sample, but we generally want to spread this over a large area. And if we just replicate our sample, we see, we can see the replication. So the advantage of having a procedure is we can produce infinite, well, not infinite, but arbitrarily large extents of this texture. So this is one example of a sample input and then the extended. So we can make a whole street of these little stones. And then it allows us to do quick editing. So we have some samples that are close to the material we want, and then we can tweak those parameters and then see very rapidly in our graphic system what the impact of those changes will be. So we showed that it is feasible to do this inversion process if, again, we consider classes. So our next step is trying to generalize our concept of classes. And that's what we've been working on recently. And this work is currently available in arXiv, and we've submitted it for publication, but right now it's just available in arXiv. And this is an example of a scene where we've edited a procedural model for the bricks and for the pavement, and for several other things in the scene, as an example of what we want to be able to do with our textures. So we have these base models. These kinds of networks are basically built by artists to achieve a certain output, and so we just sort of initially have to choose between what the artists of the world have decided that they're willing to share with other people. Subsequent to when a publication of our work, there was another paper from Adobe, or basically what's becoming a company that's been absorbed by Adobe, that had the similar idea of choosing a network, but instead of training networks to learn the parameters, basically they learn the parameters by using differentiable rendering. But they can only do that for some of the parameters for filters, not for the generators. But what we'd like to do is generate graphs that from scratch, not depend on having a library of artist generated node graphs. So for some stochastic patterns, this is the process we've come up with. which is, we have our sample and we want to get, and our sample in this case is a material. It's not just an image. We have surface roughness, we have normals, we have an albedo, and what we want to do is find a procedure just to describe all those. And what we're going to do is divide these into submaterials and then find procedures for each of those submaterials. But ultimately, this is going to be restricted to sort of the class of submaterials that can be described by noise functions. So to step through this, first of all, we have to decompose the material. So, and we do this by building mask. In this case, it's some rusty metal. So we have sort of the unrusted metal and the rusted metal that we've segmented. And we do that with spectrum-aware KNN matting and instance-based decomposition. So I'll explain what that is. One thing we need to take into account the spatial spectrum of the material, because a lot of interesting materials, there's basically the same average color in a region, and sort of traditional segmentation would put those all together in one segment, but they vary locally by the spatial spectrum of the variation. So we want to take that into account. And this example is this T, where it's the same average color around a region, but obviously there's different noise characteristics in these two regions. So by taking into account that difference, we're able to properly segment the regions. And these lines here are, we ask a user to indicate with a few strokes the examples of a pair of different materials in the image. Now, besides having different materials, we have this case where, like in the tiles, we have sort of two kinds of materials. There's the material in the tiles and the materials in the grout. But the tiles, rather than being things that we want to divide up into more child materials, we see that they're similar, but with different instances. So we identify the clusters of the different instances of these tiles, and we'll then collect the statistics of how frequently each a member of each cluster occurs in the overall texture. Then once we've divided the material segmented into two materials, and we may do this hierarchically, where each of those two materials may then be segmented into two materials, and so forth and so forth. When we get down to some base materials that can be modeled by noise, we proceduralize those into noise functions, but we do that in a multispectral way. So basically, we filter the material so it's very blurred. Find a noise function to fit that, then find a noise function to fit the next level of noise, and so on. And this makes a big difference in the result, as opposed to taking a single layer. If we just said, oh, we want one noise function to simulate this section of the texture, we get something that's very unlike the original, which really has this multispectral characteristic. Now, so we have models for each of the leaf materials, so to speak. Then we need to proceduralize the masks that separate material 1 from material 2. And to do that, we were inspired by this paper that came out in 2020 at the Rendering Symposium by a group in France working with Bedrick Bennis at Purdue. And they introduced this idea of point process texture basis functions. So it's a very general function, a kernel and sliding window with parameters that by adjusting the parameters, you can produce a very rich variation in appearance. In particular, this is a collage they presented of the variety of textures that you can produce with different values of their point process texture function. So what we want to use is these functions in order to characterize our mask, to split it hierarchically into pairs of materials. And to do that, basically, their point process functions are sampled into this huge set of possible variations their functions can produce. So when we have our sample mask, what we basically do is a search in that space. So here it's a couple input masks for a couple of our materials. So then we find in the generated possibilities from sampling their functions what the closest one in that sampling is. And then we optimize the parameters from that starting point to find a good match to our mask. So then with the procedures to produce the mask and the subfilters, we have everything we need to build our graph, and then we can tune it by doing an end-to-end optimization. And so this is the kind of thing that we're reconstructing our input and with and without optimizing. This is our pipeline then for segmenting and then hierarchically multiple times, and then proceduralizing each leaf material and proceduralizing the masks. And even though this is building sort of simple node graphs, the results, it's non-trivial node graphs that we produce. And here are some sample results of these are measured input, albedo, normal, and roughness, and what our procedures produce. These are interesting in that, so this is a measured material with the albedo, and this is using a method of, estimating a material from a single image that Valentin Deschantre developed. What's interesting is, so say in this sample we have this, this one area that's not like the others, and in some sense, by our procedures, sort of clean up that so you don't have these, singleton outliers in the texture that if you repeated that would be very obvious. But you get this nice clean texture that doesn't have these few dark spots or this one different little cap. And here's another example. And here we have looking at these labels are doing the instances of the different the same material but slightly varied. These are animated to show that these really are materials, not just generating images, single images. So the physically captured and our procedural representation. So obviously it's not pixel by pixel exact, but it's the same material, even though it's not the same image. So again, what this allows us to do is take our sample and then expand it to an arbitrary extent. These are more expanded samples. We're also then able to make higher resolution samples of our input, because the procedure is not going to blur pixels. It's going to, if something's sharp, it's going to remain sharp as you generate the procedure at a higher resolution. Some more examples of higher resolution materials. And then importantly, the idea is, when you're authoring a material, you have something that's like what you want, but then you want to tweak it a little. And these are examples of some original samples, how we proceduralize them, and then edits you can make to take that original appearance and tune it to what you want for your application. And these are examples. You say, well, there's been a lot of texture synthesis. Why do we need the procedures? Well, if you don't want to edit and you just want to extend the material, using current texture synthesis methods, with various variations of copying sets of pixels, even using various machine learning techniques, they all end up with some weird, unreliable artifacts. So even though they've gotten sort of exciting results, none of these methods have gone into production. They're time consuming and they still have the potential for these artifacts. In comparison with the previous methods that use initial existing node graphs. And that's all I had to say. So I'll leave it at that and take comments, criticisms, suggestions, or questions, whatever you have. Thank you.